good to see all of you again. So today we've got Reanne, who's a PhD student of English literature. Her focus is on the philosophy of language and how kind of language can facilitate altered states of consciousness. And today she's going to talk about Huxley's model of kind of exploring altered states of consciousness. Right?
Thank you.
Take it away.
I feel really bad because a lot of people have sort of heard this talk before. Just pretend you haven't heard it. So, the notion that man has a body distinct from his soul is to be expunged. This I shall do by printing in the infernal method, by corrosives, which in hell are salutary and medicinal, melting apparent surfaces away and displaying the infinite which is here. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks in his castle. I know that's right. Yes. So when Huxley sort of first took mescaline, he was expecting a sort of Blakean experience. He was expecting to see angels and entities. But what he got was sort of infinity in his grey flannel trousers and the divine in a chair leg. No, it wasn't what he was expecting at all. And these became these really quite famous Huxley moments. This is really important because suddenly the sort of the mystical divine, it isn't this angelic realm out there. It's of this world. You know, it's around us all the time. It's in the moss on the tree. It's in the river. It's in the blank white walls. It's everywhere. It's not in this Blakean angelic realm. And this was a bit of a surprise to Huxley. He wasn't really expecting to see that. And he didn't really fully explore it at first. It sort of became more important as time went on, which is what I want to sort of get to. So out of curiosity, who's read The Doors of Perception? Okay. But, no. To be honest, even if you haven't read it, if you have sort of any interest in psychedelics, you'll be really familiar with the content. It's kind of rippled throughout psychedelic history. So I've been fairly sort of fanatically focused on Huxley in the psychedelic community at large for a little while now. And what I've noticed is that Aldous Huxley is such a ubiquitous presence in our conversations about psychedelics that we often forget to talk about him. You know, he's sort of probably quoted more than any other author, especially in scientific and medical tracts. But it has always become the symbol of intellectual legitimacy. You know, he's called upon to read a sophisticated soundbite about a psychedelic experience. And he's so much more than that. His work speaks to some really, really critical issues that are important today. So I'd like to explore some of that. I'll tell you a little bit about his early life, sort of how he came to psychedelics and sort of the ideas that fed into that. And then I want to talk a little bit about language and how he used language in interesting ways to try and articulate these experiences. So I think with Huxley, there's a bit of a misconception that he was this sort of great English literary figure who was sort of really quite square. And then in the 1950s, he took mescaline and Humphrey Osmond and had all these really far-out ideas. And it wasn't really like that. And the more you get to know Huxley, the more you realise that things like The Doors of Perception and his work on psychedelics, it wasn't really the outcome of psychedelics. The real pivotal notions that he talked about language and philosophy and non-dualism, it's all there in his earlier work. So mescaline and LSD, it brought in some clarity, but it wasn't really new information. So, first how I've used PowerPoint. So, Huxley was sort of born into this world of science versus spirituality. His grandfather was Thomas Huxley, a sort of famous English biologist who supported Darwin's theories, very much kind of orthodox science. Less famous on his mother's side was Matthew Arnold, his great uncle. And Matthew Arnold was a Victorian essayist and poet. And Arnold was what's known as a sage writer, which is basically someone who tries to bring ancient wisdom to contemporary issues. And quite unusually, writing in the 1800s, Matthew Arnold, he really deconstructed the term of God. He saw it as a sort of poetic term. He didn't really believe in a creator, but he understood the sort of social and psychological importance of spirituality. So we have sort of Matthew Arnold's influence on Aldous alongside that of Thomas Huxley. I imagine most of us here, especially well, I assume we're all raised in the West, have felt this conflict before in the sort of spiritual narratives in culture, and then what we learn in sort of science and biology. But I think with Huxley it's particularly tangible, just given the proximity of these two intellectual giants. And this really sort of fed into his early work. And there were a lot of difficulties in Huxley's younger years as well. So when he was 14, his mother died. When he was 17, he contracted this eye disease that left him pretty much blind for 3 years, and then he always struggled with vision throughout his life after that. And then at 20, his brother Trevenant committed suicide after a period of depression. So perhaps sort of unsurprisingly, his early work's really cynical, it's really saturated with this pessimism. And it wasn't until the sort of mid-30s after Brave New World. How do people read Brave New World? So, it wasn't until after that he started taking a bit more of a sort of optimistic approach towards human potential. But what this did is turn away from satire and pessimism. It really compromised his credibility as a novelist. His reputation was built on this sort of cutting cynicism. And it's true, I mean, informed ideas and wise characters, they often don't make good novels. So bad sentiments make good novels. And people like dystopias, they like the mockery and the irony. I think even beyond that, it goes much deeper. I think that in the West, sort of depictions of hell have been a lot more interesting than depictions of paradise. You know? But fortunately, this didn't deter him too much. Now, to get a picture of the philosophies that Huxley developed, it's important to understand some of his influences. And one of these was D.H. Lawrence, who wrote Oh, very good. Yeah. Maria Huxley, Huxley's wife, actually typed up the manuscript to Lady Chatterley's letter in Switzerland. But now they were really, really good friends. So went on holidays together. And it was a really important friendship as well, because D.H. Lawrence convinced Huxley that sort of self-realization, spiritual growth, it has to include the physical. You know, Huxley was this quite sort of introverted, withdrawn character, and Lawrence is this real kind of extroverted, sort of passionate sensualist. You know, Huxley said that whereas he would merely think his opinions, Lawrence would live them. And that was it. It was you know, that self-realization, it can't just be in sort of intellectual abstractions, sort of that ivory tower of academia. Because Huxley had excelled academically. You know, he'd been through Eton and Oxford, but he often commented that academia was too specialised, that it didn't put enough emphasis on sort of general wisdom and being human. He was extremely well read. He had a special suitcase made actually so he could take the Encyclopedia Britannica on holiday with him. You know, that's the kind of guy he was. But he never claimed to be a formal specialist in anything. he felt that he was at best service as a generalist, you know, a role that's quite undervalued in our culture. Igor Stravinsky once described Huxley as a kind of handy neighbourhood university. And apparently Stravinsky used to play this game where he'd sort of ring him up on the phone and be like, Aldous, what's the history of scissors? And Aldous like usually had the answer. And then the sort of scientific side of things, his friend said he was really good friends with Edwin Hubble, and they'd go to these parties and have these long discussions about the expansion of the universe that was really tedious and just boring for everybody else, but that's just the sort of scope of his interests. Now another one of his, probably his biggest influence was this guy, Krishnamurti. Krishnamurti is a really weird biography actually. As a 14-year-old, he was discovered by this guy Charles Leadbeater in whilst he was on the beach of Madras. And he was chosen to become this world teacher, this spiritual leader who was going to lead mankind into a better future. So Krishnamurti moved to America, and during his sort of spiritual education he came to completely reject the concept of gurus. You know, although this guy was a philosopher and a public speaker, he'd often say like, I'm not your guru. He felt that a religious man ought to have no dogmas. And he didn't have a specific practice either. People would come up to him and say, you know, what can I do to help me get closer to enlightenment? Like, what can I practice? And he'd say, well, why do you want that? That was to show people that the desire for transcendence was just tied up in some ego game, often. So Krishnamurti had a big influence on Huxley, and they became lifelong friends after they met in 1938. And we could split hairs and say, well, where do you draw the line between a sort of influential teacher and a guru? But Huxley felt confident in that distinction, and this anti-guru message, it comes up again and again in Huxley's work. You know, in The Doors of Perception, we get this line, angels have the vanity to speak of themselves as the only wise. You know, there's no only wise, there's no such thing as the way. There are many paths up the mountain. And then, I mean, in his final novel, we get the same thing in a different form. He says, give us this day our daily faith, but deliver us, dear God, from belief. People have different ideas about what faith and belief mean, but for Huxley, faith was open-ended and belief was dogmatic. And Huxley found worship, just in general, really problematic. He thought if you sort of submit to these gurus and scriptures and practices, then you're almost guaranteed to get trapped in dualities and divisions, because to raise up the sacred is to divide it. It's to make it something that's not of this world anymore. And that's really, really important. That has kind of ecological implications as well. But I should add that we're not to take Huxley's advice too seriously either. If we were to blindly follow him in rejecting all gurus, then he's just the guru of anti-guruism, and the whole thing is just nonsense. But it's just useful to take a tour around these ideas and these thoughts. But yes, it's from this sort of Krishnamurti nexus that he also gets his ideas about non-meditation. So Huxley felt that you didn't have to stop doing anything or start doing anything to meditate. You simply had to really just be there in the thing you're doing. It's that sort of mindfulness before everyone was talking about its mindfulness. And the same with philosophy. He felt that just memorizing a lot of Buddhist scriptures or Vedanta, it could just be a way to kind of show how sort of clever you are. He really saw how spirituality, especially Eastern spirituality, was at risk of being commodified. And this issue really resonates today, I think. Of course, he'd always been really critical of consumer culture as well, sort of modern entertainment, which is probably exacerbated by living in California. He spent the sort of afternoon of his life there. And, speaking of modern amusements, there's this really nice little anecdote, actually. So Walt Disney once employed Huxley to work on the script for Alice in Wonderland. He was a screenwriter in Hollywood. It's a really, really unsuccessful one. And in sort of Walt Disney's own words, I hired Mr. Huxley to write a part for Lewis Carroll, but he was brainy. The second day, he handed me a 10-page outline of what should be done. It was so literary, you could understand only every third word. If you want to work in Hollywood, it's not good to have brains. Walt Disney was saying that. Intriguing. Anyways, complete tangent. And there were loads of people that influenced Huxley. So, Alan Watts, Christopher Isherwood, Gerald Hurd. I won't go through his entire address book. But there are a few strands to basically show you that so these thoughts and influences are already well in place by the time we get to 1953, when he wrote The Doors of Perception, published it the next year. I'm just going to briefly explain what The Doors of Perception is, because my parents are here, and it's just occurred to me that I've never told you to read it. No. Does anyone else want to explain what The Doors of Perception is? No, of course they don't. So in 1953, Huxley took mescaline, which is sort of psychedelic derived from cactus, and he was with a psychiatrist called Humphrey Osmond, and they had this beautiful afternoon together, and Huxley wrote an essay. Huxley wrote this essay called The Doors of Perceptions about his experiences on mescaline. It was interesting because sort of no one outside the medical community was talking about this. It was way before that whole sort of 1960s counterculture. And it actually wasn't received that well in literary circles at all, but it had this huge influence on well, sort of into the 60s. But for all the sort of merits and just marvellous metaphors that are in this work, it's kind of riddled with issues that Huxley spent a long time trying to resolve. So shortly after Huxley wrote this essay, I have a slide actually. So shortly after writing this essay, Huxley felt that he'd kind of done a bit of a disservice to the sort of potential of psychedelics, that he'd had this sort of profound experience, but he kind of missed the point. So this was written after one trip. He'd had one sort of psychedelic trip, and it was before anyone really understood the power of set and setting. And we see this in the essay. So Huxley will make these sweeping generalizations, like, as a rule, the mescaline taker discovers an inner world as self-evidently infinite and holy. Like, as a rule, I'd hesitate to say as a rule about anything so related to psychedelics. So they knew that mescaline affected people in different ways, but they didn't really know sort of how powerful the setting was. So it's one trip that went down in history and influenced a whole movement. Like I say, Huxley felt he did a little bit of a disservice, that he'd emphasised the wrong thing. So in this essay, he talks about, whilst he's having this experience, he talks about avoiding eye contact with people. You know, he's on the floor, and how the loss of self made it impossible for him to be concerned about people. He likens mescaline to a contemplation that's incompatible with action, and even the will to action. Now the following year, in October 1955, he had another mescaline experience. He did it again, but this time with Laura Archera, who became his second wife. And this was the first time he'd taken psychedelics sort of outside this sort of clinical context, without a scientist sort of making notes and asking the wrong questions, according to him. And as you can imagine, it was really quite different. So he had mescaline with Laura, and he had another profound experience. And he wrote to Humphrey Osmond about this. And he said, "I was this fact, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that this fact occupied the place where I'd been. The result was that I did not, in the first experience, feel cut off from the human world. I was intensely aware of it, and all the things which entirely drew my attention on that first occasion, I now perceive to be temptations. Already in 1955, he's recognizing some of the pitfalls and the doors of perception. He felt that it was too focused inwards, and he spent a lot of time sort of trying to compensate for this. You know, like psychedelics are often seen as these agents of transformation. Now, it's a useful metaphor, but what Huxley realized was that that transformation, it doesn't happen at the time. You know, it's part of a continuous process of remodeling worldviews. Which brings us to Island. Has anyone read Island? Mum, never read Island. I'm going to tell everyone else to read Island, but I don't think you like it. Very briefly, Island is it's wonderful. It's really wonderful if you're into books where absolutely nothing happens. 300 pages. So Island it's set on this fictional island of Parla, and what he's doing is exploring this alternative social model. So in Parla, it's this sort of blend of sort of Western medicine, Eastern mysticism, what we got, indigenous practices, yoga, tantric sex, psychedelics. So psychedelics are a really integral part of the culture. And what happens is this English journalist called Will Farnaby sort of purposely shipwrecks himself on the island, and the novel is sort of Will just exploring the island and talking to people. And Will's your kind of typical English middle-class guy. You know, he's intelligent, he's kind of cringeworthy, he's sort of cynical, doesn't like to take responsibility for anything. He's not likable necessarily, but he's quite relatable. Like I said, I say novel, there isn't a whole lot in the way of storyline. It's more of a sort of open day in Parla, which is kind of why it was criticised. And he actually asked Christopher Isherwood to try and help him with the storyline a bit, because it was all ideas and no story. It took him 6 years to write this thing, he just sort of couldn't get it right. Personally, I have excessive love for this. Sort of, when I read this, this was my first psychedelic experience. It changed everything. Sort of read this book, and everything sort of fascinated them by sort of language, kind of like catalyzed by reading this novel. But even I admit that it's a bit sort of like a load of mini essays from these preachy characters. But aside from that, it's really, really wonderful. It's sort of accessible and thought-provoking. Yeah, it's great. Read it if you want. But so what we get is a culture whose philosophy isn't based on scientific materialism and dualism. They don't reject it. They see it as this perspective that's useful for science. So division of the subject and the object, that's useful for science. But in education, everyone's encouraged to see nature as this sort of unified whole, and understand this idea that maybe the brain doesn't produce consciousness, maybe it transmits consciousness. It's that filter metaphor that we hear a lot in sort of psychedelic conversations. And the final chapter of this book, sorry, I'm ruining it all. The final chapter is Will having this psychedelic experience with the moksha medicine, which is a psychoactive toadstool. And even if you can't just bear to get through the novel, just read this chapter. It's really, really beautiful. It's this long description of his experience. And it's quite different from the doors of perception. Huxley had a lot more sort of psychedelic experience at this point. And he sort of responds to some of the things in the Doors of Perception. So whereas he was sort of avoiding eye contact before, the trip in Ireland, the woman who's sitting with Will is saying, Will, you haven't made eye contact with me for this whole trip. Look at me, engage with me. You know, he's directly responding to what he got wrong. Actually, he wrote this chapter. He and Laura were living in California, and their entire house burned down. And in 1961, they lost everything. They lost all his library. He sort of managed to go in and rescue the manuscript of Ireland and some Italian suits that he had. There were 3 crates that survived this sort of desert fire. One was sort of this crate of books to go to the charity shop. The other was a crate of firewood that survived the fire. Incredibly. But sort of after this happened, this was when he finished Ireland. It was in the weeks after that. That's when he kind of put a nail in it, and he wrote this. And he wrote it up. Will's psychedelic experience. Like I said, the trips in Ireland, the psychedelic trips in Ireland, are filled with empathy and sort of filled with empathy and sort of focused on the inner lives of others. You know, he's looking at how we might outwardly project this state of consciousness. You know, it's more than just integration, which we often think of this separate thing that comes after. It's a weaving of worldviews, and he's trying to synthesize the insights that he'd had, or the clarifications that he had with psychedelics. You know, he's not indulging in this passive contemplation anymore. He's, he's putting it out there. One of the main characters in Ireland explains to Will, he says, for a while, the moksha medicine, it'll show you, you know, you'll know what it's like to be what in fact you've always been, but like everything else, it'll pass. And when it's passed, what will you do with the experience? What will you do with all the other similar experiences that the moksha medicine will bring you in the years to come? And Huxley really despaired that this work wasn't taken seriously. I think even now, there's some lingering misconceptions about Ireland. So in the sort of like literary criticism, which doesn't get that much attention, but it's often pitched as this antidote to Brave New World, sort of the utopia to his dystopia, sort of counterpart. And the problem with that is that it suggests that Ireland is also a work of science fiction, and it's not. It wasn't written that way, and it was never meant to be received that way. It's supposed to be a set of, sincere suggestions. So that's Ireland. It speaks to sort of some of the issues with the Doors of Perception, but it has some structural issues. The reason that I'm really interested in Ireland is the fact that it's a novel, It didn't really, well, people say it didn't really need to be a novel, but Huxley felt that he could reach a wider audience in this format. It didn't really happen that way. The Doors of Perception is much more popular, but I think it's just because it's shorter, and people like shorter texts. But what the novel format allows him to do is get a bit more experimental with language, because with Huxley, for all his progressive ideas, he wasn't much of an experimental writer, to be honest. But what he did, he made this really important distinction between literary language and scientific language. And the Doors of Perception, this essay, although it's beautifully written, it's kind of rooted in psychiatric and medical curiosity. For the sake of legitimacy, there was a need to some extent conform with scientific discourse. So let's just park that for a second and talk about language. So, in our day-to-day lives, we have this quite useful materialist framework where we give names to the things that we imagine to exist in empty space. That's how we sort of agree to communicate most of the time. But language isn't just that. Language isn't just the names that we give to stuff. Once you get past this framework into a more sort of interconnected, universe in process, as we often do through psychedelics and other means, then our worlds become more malleable. Mind and matter mingle, and it's in this arena that language takes on a different role. Our lives, our perceptions, our memories, they're narratives. I think a really good example of this is the fact that our memories aren't fixed. They're highly impressionable. They're stories that we create and recreate in the moment of remembering. And it's really easy to forget this, but of course that's where a lot of therapy is, where sort of reframing the narratives of our worlds. And when we really notice this co-creative perception that's going on in every single moment, all the time, it's always now, we see that language isn't just a tool for representation, it's a tool for transformation as well. Anyone who's been successfully hypnotized might have a more direct sense of this as well. When we talk about the psychedelic experience, or especially the sort of transcendent elements of the psychedelic experience as being ineffable, as being beyond words, so we really relegate language in these conversations and we deem it so unworthy. And it's just worth reminding ourselves that language can be a really, really powerful key to novel insights and ideas. There's a strange tongue that we need to take us to these places, language that both clarifies and obscures even the most familiar experiences. And in scientific disciplines, it's kind of important that one word means one thing. If we say the name of a chemical or a body part, then there's as little ambiguity as possible. That's important. The whole thing doesn't really work otherwise. But in literature and the arts, we value a different kind of language. We value ambiguity, where one phrase can have multiple meanings. That way we can return to a poem again and unravel new implications and induce new experiences. And of course we do. We read our favourite novels and we watch our favourite films again and again for the experience, in a way that we don't tend to do with a chemistry textbook, although we might, and of course this isn't a binary spectrum, and it varies between individuals, but you get a general idea. And this is really obvious. We know this, of course we do. But I'm not sure that we always know that we know it and what the implications are, because it's so easy to think of language as this one thing. This William Blake poem is in English, and so is this medical journal. We're happy to distinguish different narrative styles, but this goes just one step further. This is a different value system. It's a different philosophy of language. So, a few words about consciousness before we tie it all together. So in circles like this, whatever we are, we talk about things like consciousness extending beyond the brain, the concepts of Gaia and the organic, holistic conception of ourselves and the universe. And through psychedelics and other means, we can induce a direct experience of what these philosophies are sort of aiming at. Where there's sort of no clear boundary between the self and the other, we sort of witness this perpetual becoming of the environment's fluid. I don't need to say this. Language gets a little bit awkward here, especially scientific language, which is sort of valued for its ability to contrast and classify. Whereas here we're talking about states where everything blends into one, you've got this sort of mismatch. So Huxley was really, really aware of this. And he was absolutely obsessed with the potentials and the limitations of language. He's got this sort of beautiful quote, which is, words are great servants, but bad masters. I think that sums it up quite well. Like I said, this idea of the ineffable, it comes up in so many conversations about psychedelics, but describing something as ineffable, it's still describing it, just not very well. And Huxley found some ineffability, in all experiences. It wasn't just a problem in describing the psychedelic experience, Language is always incommensurable with the facts, but psychedelics make this more obvious. But let's not be diverted from the power of language. And for me, one of Huxley's biggest contributions to thought is this idea that, yeah, okay, our language is limited, but it's not all equally limited. Especially once you get away from the idea of words as labels. And he has some favourite ways of demonstrating this, some sort of creative ways of getting language to trickle into new areas. I'm only going to mention a couple, but there are loads of these, and they appear throughout his entire canon of work, but they're there in abundance in Ireland. So one thing we have in Huxley's work is foreign terminology, and throwing words and phrases from all different languages. And he wasn't just showing off the fact that he spoke loads of different languages, which he did. And of course we all know that there are sort of subtleties that can be expressed in some languages and not others, but this is something a little bit different. This is the placement of a word, a sort of a foreign word, in a context where otherwise you might not understand it. So, for example, in Ireland, he doesn't go near the term psychedelic. This was only 1962, but he doesn't go near it. It's all moksha. And moksha is Sanskrit for liberation, but it doesn't actually translate that neatly. But I think what this does, it sort of facilitates a certain cognitive flexibility. If you don't quite know what a word means, like moksha, then you avoid all the drug paradigms, you avoid all the sort of prejudices and biases that you've got tied up in certain words. And that's useful. Now another thing he does is just sort of randomly, or seemingly randomly just capitalise different things. And he wasn't the first to do this. Of course, the Romantics distinguished nature with a big N from nature with a small n, but Huxley really uses it everywhere. And he does it when he wants to emphasise the event and not the subject. So for example, he'll capitalise the word fever if fever is what is dominating a particular situation. So there's this nice example from this book called After Many a Summer Dies the Swan. And the man speaking, he's in a lot of pain. He says, well, the words are quite untrue, for it was not I who lay at death's door, nor is it I who am recovered. The first was a special creation of fever, capital F, an embodiment of pain, capital P. Basically, the subject here is secondary to the fever and the pain, and it's a good technique for exposing, the fallacy of a consistent perceiving subject. If suddenly the I in consciousness, it's not so easily located. And a lot of these sort of semantic tricks and techniques, they're framed within conversations as well. A good way of avoiding the sort of long, meandering trip reports that I'm sure a lot of us have been guilty of writing as well. Yeah. But as I say, there are loads of things. He's got all these little tricks. But there's just one more that I want to mention. And that's the way he uses scientific jargon. So, like I said, science and poetry, they don't simply use different styles. It's a different philosophy of language completely. And what he'll do is he'll sort of juxtapose experience with the language of chemistry. So in Ireland, Will, the slightly Westerner, he comes out with this really weird line. He says, purgatory is tetraethylene sulfurated hydrogen. Paradise, very definitely, is sim-trinitropsy-butyl-toluene. It's like, what? It's nonsense. A handful of people know what those things are. But I think, more importantly, it sort of speaks to this habit we have of trying to just linguistically categorize everything. And Huxley comes back to this method again and again to show the limitations of materialistic science and its use of language. Huxley was really concerned about this perceived hierarchy between science and the arts. And it still pervades culture today. Even in the scientific community, all the sort of public engagement, it comes to psychiatry and neuroscience. And it's brilliant. It's really wonderful work. But I don't know if it's enough, because sort of scientific language is rather firmly rooted to these materialistic worldviews. It has to be. But I think just being aware of this is a good start, you know. In scientific and medical language, it needs to be based on contrast and classifications. I'm really not suggesting we change that, it'd be a complete nightmare, but it shows us that we need poetry. You know, we need these linguistic journeys, and not as a luxury, not as an afterthought, for the experiences that they can induce and facilitate. We're at this point now, I think, where it's really clear, abundantly clear, that these things aren't just recreational drugs. But even beyond that, we need to remember that this isn't just medicine either. These things speak to the sort of fundamental questions about what it means to be human, what it means to be alive. And it touches on all these different areas. Anyone who was at the first sort of meeting this year, where Will sort of wrote out on the blackboards, remember, sort of all the areas that psychedelics touch upon. You know, this affects everything. Of course, there are things we can't describe when we're using language to represent, but we're in totally different territory when we're thinking about poetry and its potential. You know, to see a world in a grain of sand and heaven in a wildflower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. You know, Huxley's profound moments, they weren't just floating around in the ineffable, they were anchored in poetry and proverbs, you know, and this became a really important feature of communicating these experiences. Yeah. So if you take anything from this talk, it's just essentially that Aldous Huxley he's a lot more than what he wrote in The Doors of Perception. And just that he might be able to help us to use words more effectively. That's it.